While history remembers the grand victories of the United States in World War II, a darker reality existed behind the scenes at the Pentagon. America was a nation gripped by a specific set of strategic nightmares that kept military leaders awake at night. The first and most daunting was the two-front terror, the high-stakes gamble of fighting a massive German machine in the Atlantic, while simultaneously battling a fanatical Japanese empire across the vast Pacific. This wasn't just a logistical hurdle. It was a desperate race against time where a single collapse on either side of the globe could have led to a total Axis invasion of the American mainland. If you love World War II history, hit subscribe, drop a like, and share this video with fellow history fans. Beyond the battlefield, the U.S. was haunted by the atomic ghost, the terrifying possibility that Nazi Germany's superior scientific engine would develop the world's first nuclear weapon forced America into a frantic, multi-billion-dollar race for survival known as the Manhattan Project. This fear was compounded by the silent lethality of the German U-boat wolf packs, which threatened to starve the Allies into submission by severing the vital supply lines in the Atlantic. Even as they pushed forward, the American spirit was tested by the haunting psychological toll of Japanese kamikaze attacks, a level of suicidal resolve that suggested the road to victory would cost millions of American lives. Ultimately, the greatest fear wasn't just losing a battle, but the existential dread that the light of democracy might be permanently extinguished by the rising tide of global fascism. Behind these fears was a strategic reality that few civilians fully understood at the time. The United States had entered World War II after the shock of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and suddenly it found itself responsible for sustaining two enormous theaters of war separated by half the planet. Factories across the country had to transform almost overnight from producing civilian goods to building tanks, aircraft, rifles, ships, and ammunition at a pace never before attempted in human history. Military planners worried constantly about whether American industry could maintain this level of production long enough to defeat both Germany and Japan simultaneously. If production faltered even briefly, entire campaigns could collapse. Another quiet fear that haunted American leadership was the vulnerability of the homeland itself. Though the continental United States was protected by vast oceans, military planners knew that the Axis powers were experimenting with long-range submarines, potential bombing raids, and even sabotage networks operating inside allied nations. The possibility of enemy agents disrupting factories, ports, or rail systems inside the United States created an atmosphere of intense vigilance. Intelligence agencies expanded rapidly, monitoring communications, tracking suspicious activities, and attempting to ensure that the American war machine remained secure from infiltration. At sea, the threat posed by German submarines reached frightening levels during the early years of World War II. U-boats prowled the Atlantic shipping lanes, targeting merchant vessels carrying essential supplies from North America to Britain and the Soviet Union. Entire convoys could vanish beneath the waves in a single night, leaving burning oil slicks and scattered debris as the only evidence of the attack. If these supply lines collapsed, Britain could be isolated and starved into surrender, leaving the Axis powers dominant in Europe before American forces could even land on the continent. Meanwhile, the Pacific theater presented a completely different strategic nightmare. The distances involved were enormous, with thousands of miles of open ocean separating islands that had suddenly become critical battlegrounds. Every aircraft carrier, every transport ship, and every supply convoy had to navigate waters where Japanese submarines, aircraft, and surface fleets might strike without warning. Commanders feared that a single catastrophic naval defeat could open the door for further Japanese expansion and threaten Allied positions across the Pacific. As the war progressed, intelligence reports about German scientific research added another layer of anxiety. Nazi Germany possessed some of the most advanced physicists and engineers in the world, and rumors circulated that their laboratories were working on revolutionary weapons that could change the balance of the war overnight. Rockets, jet aircraft, and experimental technologies were already appearing on the battlefield. The idea that these same scientists might unlock the secrets of atomic energy before the Allies did was considered one of the most terrifying possibilities of the entire conflict. The psychological dimension of the war was equally troubling for American leaders. The behavior of Japanese forces in the Pacific demonstrated a level of determination that Western militaries had rarely encountered before. Battles frequently ended with defenders fighting until their ammunition was exhausted, followed by final charges or acts of suicide rather than surrender. Reports from battlefields like Saipan and Okinawa suggested that if Allied forces attempted to invade the Japanese mainland itself, they might face millions of defenders willing to die rather than yield. This possibility forced American strategists to confront difficult calculations about the cost of victory. Casualty estimates for a full-scale invasion of Japan reached staggering numbers, sometimes predicting hundreds of thousands or even millions of Allied losses. Military planners debated every possible option, searching for ways to end the war without triggering a catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. Even within the United States, the strain of sustaining World War II was immense. Families watched loved ones depart for distant fronts, often with little idea when, or if, they would return. War bonds, rationing programs, and factory shifts that ran day and night became part of daily life. The entire nation had been mobilized, and behind every soldier on the battlefield stood millions of workers, engineers, farmers, and shipbuilders supporting the effort. Despite these fears, American leadership remained determined to push forward. Each challenge, whether it was the threat of nuclear weapons, the danger of submarine warfare, or the brutal resistance encountered in the Pacific, forced new innovations and strategies. Convoy systems strengthened Atlantic shipping routes, radar improved naval defense, and massive industrial expansion ensured that the flow of weapons and equipment never stopped. By the later years of World War II, the same fears that once seemed overwhelming had begun to transform into sources of determination. The United States had adapted its strategy, strengthened its alliances, and harnessed its industrial power on a scale the world had never seen before. Yet the memory of those early nightmares, the possibility of losing the Atlantic, the fear of a German atomic weapon, and the prospect of endless bloody battles in the Pacific, continued to shape every decision made by American leaders as the war moved toward its final and most decisive chapters. Another looming concern within American command circles was the fragile alliance structure that held the Allied powers together. Although the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were united against the Axis, their long-term political goals were very different. American strategists feared that if coordination between these powers broke down, the Axis could exploit the division. Disagreements over where to open the second front in Europe, how resources should be distributed, and how liberated territories would be governed created constant tension behind closed doors. Maintaining unity among the Allies became almost as important as defeating the enemy itself. There was also the constant fear of technological surprise on the battlefield. German engineers had already introduced weapons that seemed years ahead of their time, including advanced rockets, jet-powered aircraft, and guided bombs capable of striking ships from long distances. Each new report arriving at intelligence offices triggered urgent discussions within the Pentagon. If Germany managed to produce these weapons in large numbers, the balance of the war could shift dramatically. American scientists and engineers therefore raced not only to match these developments, but to surpass them before they could be deployed on a devastating scale. The strategic bombing campaign added another layer of uncertainty. While American and British aircraft were steadily targeting German industry and transportation networks, planners worried about whether these missions would truly cripple the enemy's war production. The skies over Europe became some of the most dangerous battlefields of World War II, with bombers facing dense anti-aircraft fire and swarms of enemy fighters. Entire formations could be shattered in minutes, and each mission carried the risk of heavy losses. The question constantly hanging over commanders was whether the sacrifice of these aircrews would deliver the decisive impact they hoped for. At the same time, military planners could not ignore the possibility that the war might drag on for many more years. Although American industry was powerful, sustaining such an enormous conflict indefinitely placed tremendous pressure on resources and manpower. Generals had to consider scenarios where the Axis powers might prolong the war through stubborn resistance, forcing the United States to maintain massive deployments across multiple continents far longer than anyone had originally expected. Preparing for a conflict that could stretch endlessly required careful planning and constant adjustments to strategy. Yet despite all these fears and uncertainties, American leadership continued pushing forward with a mixture of caution and determination. Each challenge, whether technological, logistical, or political, forced them to refine their approach to global warfare. What began as a desperate defensive struggle after Pearl Harbor gradually evolved into a coordinated international effort capable of projecting power across oceans and continents. The anxieties that once haunted the Pentagon never fully disappeared, but they ultimately fueled the relentless drive that carried the Allied war effort through the final and decisive stages of World War II. Another persistent concern among American strategists was the unpredictable nature of global supply chains during World War II. The Allied war machine depended heavily on a constant flow of raw materials: steel, oil, rubber, aluminum, and countless other resources. If any of these were disrupted, entire production lines could stall. Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia had already cut off several major sources of natural rubber, forcing American industry to rapidly develop synthetic alternatives. Military planners understood that modern warfare was not fought only by soldiers at the front, but by factories and cargo ships operating thousands of miles away from the battlefield. There was also the quiet but ever-present fear of war fatigue within the American population. Mobilizing millions of soldiers and transforming the economy into a full war footing demanded enormous sacrifices from ordinary citizens. Rationing programs limited food, fuel, and consumer goods, while families endured years of uncertainty as loved ones fought overseas. Leaders worried that if the war dragged on too long without visible progress, public morale could begin to weaken. Maintaining a steady stream of victories and positive news therefore became an important part of sustaining the national commitment to the war effort. At the same time, intelligence officials constantly monitored the possibility of unexpected alliances or strategic shifts among the Axis powers. If Germany and Japan managed to coordinate their military strategies more effectively across continents, the pressure on Allied forces could intensify dramatically. American planners had to prepare for scenarios where new offensives might erupt in unexpected regions, forcing the United States to redirect troops and resources quickly. This uncertainty reinforced the importance of flexibility in planning, ensuring that American forces could respond rapidly to changing threats as World War II unfolded across multiple fronts.